This lecture was given on Monday, November 16th, and will examine the senses of taste, touch, and smell. We'll start with touch. When we talk about the sense of touch, we need to talk about the skin. The outer layer of the skin is called the epidermis, and the epidermis is essentially layers of dead skin cells that create a waterproof covering and make it so that mold does not grow on our actual skin. Underneath those layers of dead skin cells, we have the dermis. In the dermis, you'll find things like sweat glands, hair follicles, nerve endings, but in particular, touch receptors. Now, there are four distinct types of touch receptors. We'll talk about three of them on this slide and one on a further slide. And touch receptors, essentially what they do are neurons. They're big, long neurons that send signals through our body up our spinal cord till eventually it reaches the thalamus. The thalamus, being that train station message center of the brain, sends it to the somatosensory cortex where we perceive our sense of touch. Now, I mentioned before that there are a couple of different types of touch receptors. One touch receptor is connected to pressure. So a light intensity stimulation of this receptor will be something like when somebody rubs your skin. More intense version of this would be when someone punches you. Pressure also allows us to perceive things like texture and the roughness and smoothness of things. Another touch receptor we have is a pain receptor. Pain receptors get stimulated when there's potential damage to the body, in particular, any sort of sharp sensation. They send signals up to the brain with pretty intense stimulation, and then eventually the brain perceives it so that we don't do damage to our body. And the third primary type of touch receptor is the receptor connected to the temperature. So warmth and coldness are things that allow us to experience touch and our different touch sensations that we have. And so those temperature receptors allow us to experience levels of coldness or levels of heat. When we experience pain, it is in one of three different ways. So biologically, when pain receptors are stimulated or when there's damage to any parts of our body, those pain receptors are stimulated. They send sharp signals to our brain telling us that damage has occurred and this is where we feel it. Endorphins, however, are neurotransmitters and hormones that allow us to basically overcome that pain, to push past that pain. When we work out or when we lift weights, in order to get stronger, we're actually creating micro tears in our muscles, which then repair themselves when we sleep. And then those micro tears, though, repair themselves stronger, which is how we build our muscles and build muscular strength. Endorphins allow us to do this better because it limits the pain that we experience. Psychologically, however, we perceive pain a little bit differently. With the right state of mind, something that might be extremely painful to one person is less painful to another. For example, professional athletes play through pain all the time, pain that you and I might not be able to experience or deal with. We also seem to remember memories of pain. If we have a memory of a painful experience, such as medical procedures or a childbirth, people tend to not remember the duration of the pain. They remember, however, the peak moment, the highest intensity amount of pain, and thinking about that pain can actually cause them to feel it again. Finally, we have sociocultural influences of pain, and a lot of this comes through empathy. And we may experience pain when we see somebody else experience pain. Because we ourselves know what that pain feels like, we can actually develop some pain sensations just by seeing somebody else experience it. Now, outside of our normal senses of touch, we have two subsenses of touch. Our kinesthetic sense allows for us to feel the movement of our muscles and bones. This is particularly important so that we don't do damage to our body. And this is where we find the fourth touch receptor. It's located inside our muscles and bones and allows us to feel them moving. This could be particularly important because imagine if you keep turning your head around and then you keep turning it around, and all of a sudden, if you're not feeling the movement of the muscles, then you don't realize the damage that you're doing where you're tearing ligaments and breaking bones because you're not feeling it. And so this kinesthetic sense allows us to feel it and makes it so that we don't do as much damage to our body. Now, connected to the kinesthetic sense and our sense of touch is our vestibular sense, which is essentially our sense of balance. We have to balance based on pressure that we feel when we're standing or sitting. But here's how it works. Our balance is actually regulated by a structure in the inner ear called the vestibular sac. The vestibular sac is filled with fluid. It's the same fluid that you find in the cochlea of the inner ear. And in fact, there are tubes that connect the vestibular sac and the cochlea called semicircular canals. When we tilt our head to one side, the fluid in that sac also tilts to one side. This sends a signal to the cerebellum, the part of the brain connected to balance, to tell us to adjust our weight so that we don't fall over with our head, even though our head is tilted to one side. If you want to do a fun little experiment, spin around in a circle for about 20 seconds. When you stop, you'll still be spinning. And that's due to the idea that the fluid in your vestibular sac is still spinning in a whirlpool type movement, and it doesn't stop even though we've stopped our body, which is what it makes us feel like we're actually still spinning. The next section is on taste. When we taste, there are 5 primary flavors: sweet, sour, salty, and bitter. Now there's a 5th one called umami, developed by Japanese scientists who discovered it, and that's essentially the savory flavor of meat. Now, additionally, we can also taste metallic items, and you might have tasted this if you ever bit down on tinfoil or ever tasted your own blood and tasted the iron in your blood. And often I get the question is, well, what about spicy flavors? Well, spiciness actually isn't a flavor. In fact, spicy is probably a combination between salty and bitter. And what spicy flavor is, the heat of spicy flavor, is actually a touch sensation. We have touch receptors in our tongue, pain receptors that get stimulated by the oils from spicy foods and spicy peppers and things like that. This causes us to feel the heat, and it's actually not a flavor. The flavor itself is probably more bitter than anything else. Now, taste of any sort of sensation that we have, the one that is most augmented and enhanced by other senses is our sense of taste. Our sense of vision affects taste because vision creates a sense of expectation. If you've ever watched the Food Network, you know they always say that you eat with your eyes, because when you are perceiving that food and looking at it, you create an expectation, and when that flavor is good, it meets that expectation, and we perceive it as better. On the flip side, if you see a bowl full of mush, you could still taste it as good, but it's going to need to be really good to overcome that expectation that it's going to be disgusting. Touch affects our sense of taste. As I mentioned before, spicy foods stimulate the pain receptors in our tongue. But additionally, the texture of food can also cause us to associate the flavor as being bad. For example, the rubbery texture of calamari or of mushrooms can cause people to perceive it as flavors that they don't like. The slimy texture of things like mussels or clams can cause other people to feel like they don't like that flavor. But of all the senses that enhance taste, the most one that really affects it is our sense of smell. In fact, smell may do more for us perceiving a flavor in our brain than actually taste from our tongue. When the two work in unison, we actually perceive a flavor of the food that we're eating. As we eat, particles from inside our mouth travel through the air up into our nose, causing us to smell the odor of the flavor, along with the tasting of the flavor, which causes us to perceive the flavor in our brain. So how does taste work? Well, taste is a chemical sense because it is chemicals from the food that you are eating that are stimulating cells. They stimulate a type of cells called taste papillae. Taste papillae are those bumps on your tongue. And inside those taste papillae, we have little buds called taste receptor cells, also known as taste buds. Connected to those taste buds are gustatory nerve cells. And when those taste buds are stimulated by the chemicals of the food, the gustatory nerves create a signal that goes to the thalamus, the train station message center of the brain, and then to the gustatory cortex of the brain in the frontal lobe, where we experience our sense of flavor and taste. The last section is on our sense of smell. Like taste, smell is a chemical sense. So in this case, it is the chemicals of different objects and particles that are connected in the air, and they float along the air, along with air molecules, up into our nose. Those molecules become known as odor molecules because it is actually little particles of the things that we're smelling. So when we smell a rose, it's actually little particles of roses that are going up into our nose. When we smell grass, little particles of grass. When we smell garbage, it's little pieces of garbage that are going up into our nose. And they stimulate receptor cells in our nose known as the olfactory receptors. The official name of our sense of smell is the olfactory sense. Those olfactory receptors, those odor molecules bind to the receptors and create stimulation. And those stimulated kind of signals go up into the olfactory bulb, which is a structure right behind our eyes. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting is that the olfactory bulb sends the signal directly to the olfactory cortex. It bypasses the thalamus. It is the only sense that does this, and this may have to do with predator and prey types of things. When prey may smell a predator, having that extra split seconds, so it's basically the smell not traveling to the thalamus first, or the signal not going to the thalamus first, but going directly to the cortex where we can perceive it, gives us that split second advantage to keep us alive, which is probably why it evolved. Now, what's really kind of crazy about olfactory receptors is that there are specific receptors connected to specific odors. So when a certain type of odor, like let's say the odor of grass, gets into your nose, it's a specific receptor that's getting stimulated. When other odors, like the smell of garbage, comes into your nose, it is other receptors that get stimulated. But we know that there's more than, let's say, 150 smells out there, which is the amount of receptors that we have. And so with certain smells, they can actually be a combination of base odors that stimulate multiple receptors at the same time, where we then perceive the combination of those, and then it causes us to make us feel like it's a new smell. Finally, because of the location of where we process smell near the memory center, which is also where we process the specifics of our day-to-day events and experiences, our brain naturally associates smells with certain experiences. So when we do that experience, if there's a smell there, our brain makes this unconscious connection. And then when we smell that odor again at a different time, it may bring back the memory of that experience that we had in that first moment. So if, for example, you played catch with your parents for a certain sport out on grass, later on you may smell grass and you may remember those times in which you played catch because of the connections with smells and our experiences. This is the end of the lecture.